I spent 40 years tending to the garden where my siblings now stand, plotting my removal. I am the eldest, the one who stayed behind to care for our parents until their final breaths, while Elias, Sarah, and Julian chased lives they couldn't afford. Now, with our parents gone and the property values in our quiet cul-de-sac skyrocketing, I've become an inconvenience, a tenant in my own life. They see a house that should be sold and divided. They don't see the woman who kept the roof over their heads when they had nowhere else to go. To see the people I raised turn into strangers is a pain that doesn't scream. It just aches, quiet and constant. I need to know what happened to the children I used to tuck into bed. If you've ever been betrayed by the ones you loved most, please subscribe, like, and comment. I need to know what happened. How much of your soul can you give away before there is nothing left for them to take? The tea service was the one our mother used only for difficult conversations. It sat on the low mahogany table, the steam rising from the spout in a thin, rhythmic ghost of a trail. I watched Sarah's hands as she poured. She was always the most graceful when she was about to do something cruel. Her movements were practiced, a performance of domestic concern that she hadn't actually felt in decades. "Martha," Sarah said, her voice dropping into that soft, patronizing register she reserved for the elderly and the infirm. I was 68, not 86, but in her eyes, the difference was negligible. "We're just worried about you. This house, it's so much for one person to manage. The stairs alone. What if you fell?" I looked at the stairs. I'd climbed them that morning to dust the framed photographs of the three of them: Elias at his graduation, Sarah at her first wedding, Julian in his varsity jacket. I hadn't fallen. I hadn't even been out of breath. "I managed the stairs just fine when I was carrying Mother up and down them for 3 years, I said, my voice level. "I don't recall you being worried about the incline then." The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence that happens when the truth accidentally slips into a room full of lies. Elias cleared his throat. He was sitting in Father's old wingback chair, his suit jacket straining at the buttons. He had always been a man of appetites, for food, for status, for things he hadn't earned. He was currently on his third consulting firm, which, as far as I could tell, involved a lot of expensive lunches and very little consulting. "That's not fair, Martha," Elias said, his tone sharpening. "We all did what we could, but things are different now. The market is peaking. If we wait another year to settle the estate, we could lose hundreds of thousands. You have to be realistic. You're sitting on a gold mine, and you're treating it like a museum." "It's a home, Elias," I replied. "It's been the family home for 60 years. "It's an asset," Julian chimed in from the corner. He was the youngest, the one who usually stayed quiet until he saw which way the wind was blowing. "And honestly, it's a liability. The roof needs work, the taxes are going up, you're living on a fixed pension. How long can you actually sustain this?" I looked at Julian. He was wearing a watch that cost more than his car, a gift to himself from a bonus he hadn't yet received. I knew his bank balance better than he thought. I knew all of theirs. As a retired real estate appraiser and consultant for private investment firms, I had spent 40 years looking at the numbers people tried to hide. I had spent the last decade quietly securing my own future while they were busy mortgaging theirs. "I'm sustaining it quite well," I said. "I've kept the maintenance up, I've paid the taxes." "With what?" Sarah asked, her eyes narrowing. "Mother's savings. We've all seen the accounts, Martha. There isn't much left." I felt a spark of something cold and sharp in my chest, but I didn't let it reach my face. They thought I was surviving on the scraps of our parents' modest estate. They didn't know about the consulting fees I'd funneled into my own private LLC for years. They didn't know that while they were complaining about the cost of living in this neighborhood, I was the one who had been buying the houses around them. When the neighbor's house, the old Miller place, Went up for sale 3 years ago. I bought it through a holding company. When the cottage on the corner went into foreclosure, I snatched it up. I owned 4 of the 6 houses on this street. To them, I was the aging sister who stayed behind. To the local property records, I was a silent ghost. I have my ways, I said softly. Your ways aren't enough to stop the inevitable, Elias said, standing up. He began to pace the rug I had cleaned by hand when Julian spilled red wine on it last Thanksgiving. The 3 of us have talked. We're the majority stakeholders in the trust. We've decided to put the house on the market at the end of the month. The room seemed to shrink. I looked at the tea service, at the steam that had finally stopped rising. The tea was cold. You're kicking me out? I asked. I wanted to hear them say it. I wanted the words to hang in the air like a physical weight. We're relocating you, Sarah corrected, her voice dripping with that manufactured honey. We've looked at some lovely assisted living communities, very upscale. You'll have people your own age, activities, someone to cook your meals. It'll be like a vacation. I don't want a vacation, I said. I want to live in my house. It's not just your house, Julian said, his voice gaining a sudden, ugly confidence. It's the family's house, and the family needs the money. My kid's college tuition isn't going to pay itself, Martha. Elias has his firm to think about. Sarah has her own needs. Sarah didn't even look ashamed. She just nodded. We've already contacted a listing agent. They'll be coming by on Wednesday to take photos. It would be easier if you weren't here for that. The humiliation was a dull, thudding pulse in my temples. They were treating me like a piece of furniture that had outlived its usefulness, something to be moved or discarded to make room for something newer, shinier. They had no idea that I had spent the last month finalizing the purchase of the very house Sarah was currently renting. Nor did they know I now held the deed to the office space Elias's failing firm occupied. I stood up, my movements slow and deliberate. I felt old, yes, but I also felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: a total lack of obligation. For 40 years, I had been the safety net. I had been the one who answered the 2 a.m. phone calls and bridged the gaps in their finances. Wednesday, I repeated. I see. Don't make this difficult, Martha, Elias said, his hand on the back of my father's chair. It's for the best. You'll see that eventually. I'm sure I will, I said. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. It was a beautiful afternoon. The sun was hitting the Miller house across the way, my house. The lawn was perfectly manicured. The tenants there were a young couple, quiet and respectful. They paid their rent on time to a management company that never mentioned my name. My siblings were so focused on the walls of this one house that they couldn't see the world I had built around it. They thought they were taking my only shelter. They didn't realize they were standing in the middle of my portfolio. Is there anything else? I asked, not turning around. Just start packing the small things, Sarah said. The personal items. We'll handle the furniture and the big stuff through an estate liquidator. It'll be less stress for you. Less stress, I whispered. I heard them gathering their things, the rustle of coats, the clink of car keys. They left as they always did, with a flurry of self-importance and a trail of mess for me to clean up. As the front door clicked shut, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I went back to the table and began to stack the cold teacups. My hands were perfectly steady. I looked at the 3 cups my siblings had used, Sarah's with a smear of lipstick, Elias's with a ring of sugar at the bottom, Julian's barely touched. I thought about the lovely assisted living communities they had mentioned. I thought about the end of the month. Then I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I scrolled through my contacts until I found my attorney's name. I had one question that needed answering before Wednesday. The house was too quiet once the sound of Elias's SUV faded down the driveway. It was the kind of silence that had a weight to it, pressing against my chest as I stood in the kitchen. I didn't start packing. Instead, I did what I have done every night for 40 years. I began the dishes. The hot water felt good on my hands, a sharp contrast to the coldness that had settled in the living room. I spent a long time on Sarah's teacup, scrubbing at the smudge of dusty rose lipstick she'd left on the rim. She always wore that color when she wanted to look soft, usually right before she asked for something. When she was 22 and needed her first apartment deposit, she wore it. When she was 35 and divorcing her second husband, she wore it. Today, she wore it to tell me I was being evicted. I realized then that my siblings didn't see me as a person anymore. I was a fixture, like the water heater or the radiator, something that provided comfort and warmth but was ultimately replaceable when it became too old to be efficient. A sharp knock at the back door made me jump. I dried my hands on my apron and opened it to find Elias standing there. He looked agitated, his tie loosened, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. "I forgot my leather folio," he said, not waiting for an invitation. He pushed past me into the kitchen, his eyes scanning the counters. "I must have left it in the study." "It's in the living room, Elias, beside Father's chair," I said, my voice sounding more tired than I intended. He didn't head for the living room immediately. He stopped by the refrigerator, looking at the yellowed magnets and the various coupons I'd clipped. "You really should throw this junk away, Martha. It's depressing. It makes the place look cluttered. When the agent comes on Wednesday, we need it to look like a house people actually want to buy, not a place someone is waiting to die in." The words hit me like a physical blow, though I kept my face still. "I'm not waiting to die, Elias. I'm living. There's a difference." "Is there?" He turned to face me, his hands on his hips. "You haven't left this radius in years. You don't travel, you don't have hobbies, you just exist here. We're doing this for you as much as for us. You need a fresh start." He walked into the living room and retrieved his folio. As he came back through, he stopped at the desk in the hallway, the one where I kept the household ledgers. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering over the drawer where I kept the deed to this house. "The paperwork," he said, his voice dropping. "The original deed and the trust documents. They're in here, right?" "Everything is where it's supposed to be," I replied. "Good. Because Sarah wants to bring the appraiser by on Thursday, after the photos. We need to make sure the title is clear. There isn't any weirdness with the taxes, is there? No liens we don't know about?" "The taxes are paid in full," I said. "They always are." He nodded, seemingly satisfied, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not guilt, but a sort of hungry impatience. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He didn't ask if I needed help finding a new place. He just looked at the walls as if he were already calculating the cost of the paint he'd use to flip it. "I'll see you Wednesday," he said, heading for the door. "And please, Martha, do something about the smell of mothballs. It's pervasive." After he left, I didn't go back to the dishes. I went to the hallway desk and opened the drawer. I didn't pull out the deed to the family home. Instead, I pulled out a thick navy blue folder labeled Hemlock Management, LLC. Inside were the documents for the property at 422 Sycamore Lane, a charming 3-bedroom Tudor only 2 blocks away. Sarah lived there. She'd been renting it for 6 years, constantly complaining to the faceless corporation that owned it about the drafty windows and the aging HVAC system. She had no idea that I was the one who authorized the repairs, Or that I was the one who had kept her rent stagnant for 3 years because I knew she was struggling after her last divorce. I sat in the dim light of the hallway and realized a painful truth. My siblings didn't just want the money. They wanted to be free of the psychological burden of me. As long as I was in this house, I was a reminder of the parents they had neglected and the sister who had sacrificed her youth so they could have theirs. By putting me in a community, they could finally file me away in a cabinet, visited only on holidays when they felt the need to perform virtue. I picked up the phone and called Mr. Aris. It was late, but I paid him enough to ensure he'd answer. "Martha," he said, his voice gravelly but professional. "I assume you've had the conversation?" "I have," I said. "They're moving forward. They want me out by the end of the month." "I'm sorry, Martha. Truly. I know how much that house means to you." "It means less than it did this morning," I said, looking at the scuff marks Elias's expensive shoes had left on the floorboards. "Tell me about 422 Sycamore, Sarah's lease." I heard the rustle of papers over the line. "It's a standard month-to-month agreement now, as it's been for 2 years. Under the terms of the LLC, you have the right to terminate with 30 days' notice for personal use or major renovations." "And Elias's office space? The suite on West 4th? "That one is a bit more complex. He's behind on the common area maintenance fees, about 4 months. We could initiate an eviction process based on the breach of contract tomorrow if you wished." I closed my eyes. I thought about the mothball smell Elias had mocked. I thought about Sarah's patronizing tone, treating me like a child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. "Not tomorrow," I said softly. "Wait until Wednesday afternoon, after the photographer finishes at the house." "Martha," Mr. Aris paused, "are you sure you want to go this route? Once the notices are served, there's no going back to the way things were." "The way things were ended the moment they sat at my table and told me I was a liability," I said. "But I have one more question, Ben. The Miller house, the one directly across the street from me. Is it still vacant?" "It is. The previous tenants moved out last Friday. Why?" I looked out the front window. The Miller house was dark, its windows reflecting the street lamps. It was a beautiful house, sturdy and well-kept, better than this one in many ways. "I think I'm going to need a place to stay," I said. "And I'd like to have a front row seat for the 'coming soon' sign they're so excited to put in my yard." "You're going to move across the street?" There was a hint of a smile in his voice. "I've spent 40 years being invisible, Ben," I said. "I think it's time they finally see me." I hung up the phone and walked back to the kitchen. I finished the dishes, dried the sink until it shone, and then went to the basement. I didn't look for boxes. I looked for the spare key to the Miller house, which I'd kept in a small velvet box for 3 years. As I held the key, I felt a strange, cold flutter in my stomach. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that for the first time in my life, I wasn't protecting my siblings from the world. I was letting the world, and my place in it, finally catch up to them. But as I looked at the key, I wondered, once I pulled the rug out from under them, would I be able to live with the person I had to become to do it? Tuesday morning arrived with a thin, gray light that seemed to expose every crack in the floorboards. I woke up at 5:30 a.m., just as I have for decades. My body didn't care that my tenure in this house was being terminated. The coffee pot still needed to be filled. The dust on the mantel still needed to be cleared. I was halfway through the kitchen when I noticed the box. It was a large cardboard moving box, sitting on the dining table like an insult. Julian must have left it there when he came back late last night to check the locks. It was empty, its flaps open like a hungry mouth. There was a sticky note attached in Julian's hurried architectural print. Start with the china cabinet. S says she wants the silver service appraised by Friday. I didn't touch the box. I made my coffee and sat in the breakfast nook, looking out at the backyard. I remembered when Julian was 6 and had broken his arm falling out of the oak tree. I was the one who drove him to the ER while our parents were away on a rare weekend trip. I was the one who signed the forms. I was the one who stayed awake all night, making sure he didn't have a concussion. Now he was the one telling me which of my mother's memories to pack first. At 10 o'clock, the doorbell rang. It wasn't the aggressive double chime of Elias or the rhythmic tap of Sarah. It was a single, hesitant ring. I opened the door to find Julian. He was dressed in his work clothes, expensive denim and a tailored shirt, looking every bit the successful architect who specialized in modernizing historic districts. "Hey, Marth," he said, shifting his weight. He was holding a cardboard carrier with 2 coffees. "Thought you might need a caffeine boost before you start, you know." "I have coffee, Julian," I said, but I stepped aside to let him in. He walked into the kitchen and set the coffee down on the table, right next to the empty box. He looked around the room with a professional eye, the same way he looked at a site before a demolition. "You haven't started," he noted, his voice carefully neutral. "Sarah's going to be a bit stressed if the common areas aren't clear for the photographer tomorrow. She's already stressed enough about the commission split." "The house is clean, Julian. It's been clean for 60 years. I know. It's just, the vibe needs to be different. Less lived in, more potential. People want to see themselves here, not someone else's history." He picked up a small ceramic bird from the windowsill, a gift Julian himself had made in a pottery class when he was 9. He turned it over in his hand, then set it back down with a shrug. "This kind of stuff. It's just clutter now." The bird had been on that windowsill for 30 years. To him, it was a piece of clay that didn't fit a vibe. To me, it was the memory of a little boy who had been so proud of the lopsided wings. "How is the firm, Julian?" I asked, changing the subject. "I heard you lost the contract for the new library." Julian's face tightened. The nice sibling mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "Economic downturn. People are playing it safe. That's why this sale is so important, Martha. It's a liquidity event. It helps everyone get back on their feet." "And what happens when I'm on my feet in an upscale community 3 towns away? Do you plan to visit? Or will I just be a line item in your monthly budget?" Julian looked away. He couldn't handle directness. He preferred the language of blueprints and liquidity. "Don't be like that. We'll visit. Of course we will. But you have to admit your lifestyle here, it's stagnating. You're rattling around in here like a ghost. It's not healthy." He stayed for another 20 minutes, talking about curb appeal and neutral palettes. He never once asked me where I wanted to live. He never once asked if I was scared. He assumed that because I had always been the stable one, I didn't have feelings that could be hurt. I was just the infrastructure. After he left, leaving the coffee to go cold on the table, I put on my coat. I didn't start the china cabinet. Instead, I walked out the front door, down the porch steps, and across the street. The air was crisp, smelling of damp earth and the neighbor's wood smoke. I walked straight up the driveway of the Miller house. I felt the weight of the key in my pocket. It was heavy, cool, and real. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house smelled of nothing, just empty air and a hint of floor wax. It was a beautiful house, a 1920s craftsman that had been meticulously maintained. The previous tenants had kept it spotless. I walked through the living room to the large bay window that faced the street. From here, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of my family home. I could see the peeling paint on the shutters that Elias had promised to fix 5 years ago. I could see the overgrown hydrangea bush that Sarah said made the house look dowdy. From this perspective, the house looked smaller. It looked vulnerable. I sat down on the built-in window seat. I realized that for my entire life, I had been looking out of those windows, watching my siblings leave. I had watched them drive away to college, to weddings, to better lives, always knowing I would be there to welcome them back when those lives hit a snag. Now, for the first time, I was the one on the outside looking in. There was a strange, cold power in the shift of perspective. Tomorrow, the photographer would come. Tomorrow, Sarah would walk through my rooms and decide which parts of my life were clutter. Tomorrow, Elias would call the estate liquidator to put a price tag on our mother's sewing machine. But they wouldn't see me watching. I looked at the house Sarah lived in, just 2 blocks down. She had been late on her rent twice this year, and each time I had instructed the management company to waive the late fee, telling myself she was just going through a transition. I thought about Father's final words to me, whispered in the hospital when the others were down in the cafeteria. Martha, they have their mother's heart, but they have my ambition. Don't let them trade one for the other. I hadn't understood then. I thought he was warning me to keep them close. Now I realized he was warning me to keep myself safe. I stood up and walked to the kitchen of the Miller house. I opened the cabinets. They were empty, waiting to be filled. I decided then that I wouldn't pack the china. I wouldn't pack the silver. I would leave it all. If they wanted to liquidate our history, let them see how empty the house felt without the person who had made it a home. I reached for my phone and sent a text to Mr. Aris. Proceed with the notices for 422 Sycamore and the West 4th Suite. Hand deliver them Wednesday at 4 p.m., not a minute earlier. As I locked the Miller house and walked back across the street, I saw a white van pulling into my driveway. A man with a camera got out. He looked at the house, then at his clipboard. "You the owner?" he asked, pointing his lens at the front porch. "I'm the sister," I said. "Right." The agent said to start with the exterior. "Can you move those potted plants? They're a bit dated." I looked at the geraniums I had planted in my mother's old ceramic pots. They were bright red, defiant against the gray afternoon. "No," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I think they should stay exactly where they are." He shrugged and started snapping photos. I went inside and closed the door, locking it behind me. I had 24 hours left in this house, and for the first time in 40 years, I wasn't going to spend them cleaning up after anyone else. But as I sat in the darkening living room, I found myself staring at the phone. I was waiting for the one thing I knew wasn't coming. A call from any of them that didn't start with a demand. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the clinical precision of an execution. Sarah was the first to show up, trailing a cloud of expensive perfume and carrying 2 bags of neutral throw pillows. She didn't knock. She used her own key, a privilege I'd given her years ago when she was going through her first divorce and needed a safe place to land in the middle of the night. Now, she used it to invade. "Martha, you're still in your house coat?" she asked, her eyes scanning the living room with the cold, assessing gaze of a predator. "The photographer is going to be here in 20 minutes. We need to look like a lifestyle, not a retirement home." "I'm not in a house coat, Sarah. This is a cardigan. It's 60 degrees in here because the heater is rattling again," I said. She ignored me, stepping over to the mantel. Without a word, she began to take down the framed photographs. My wedding day. The brief, happy year before the accident took him. Our parents' 50th anniversary. A photo of the four of us at the lake house when we were children, before the competition for our father's approval had turned them into rivals, and me into a referee. "What are you doing with those?" I asked, my voice tightening. "Clutter, Martha. These frames are dated. The wood is too dark. It makes the room feel heavy," she said, sliding them into the cardboard box Julian had left on the table. "We want the buyers to see their own families on this mantle, not ours." She spoke as if I weren't there, or perhaps as if I were already a ghost haunting the hallways. She began to toss the pillows she'd brought onto my sofa, linen-covered things that looked uncomfortable and felt like sandpaper. They were a beige so pale it looked like a lack of conviction. "I've lived in this house for 40 years, Sarah," I said, standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "My history isn't clutter, it's the foundation." "And foundations get cracks," she snapped, her mask of polite concern finally slipping. "Look, I'm doing the heavy lifting here. I'm the one who had to find the stager, the one who's coordinating the listing. All you have to do is stay out of the way for a few hours. Is that really too much to ask?" She didn't wait for an answer. She moved to the window and yanked the curtains open, the sunlight harsh and unforgiving against the carpet. Elias arrived 10 minutes later, his phone pressed to his ear. He was arguing with someone about a bridge loan and overhead costs. He didn't even look at me. He walked straight to the dining room, checked the floorboards for creaks, and then poked his head into the kitchen. "Sarah, did you get the flowers for the island? The agent said lilies. They signify freshness or some nonsense," Elias called out. "They're in the car, Elias. Get them yourself," Sarah shouted back from the hallway. They were treating my home like a stage set, and I was merely a prop that didn't fit the aesthetic. I went into the kitchen to make a pot of tea, the only thing I felt I had control over. But Elias blocked the stove. "Not now, Martha. The steam will fog the windows. We need the glass to be crystal clear for the wide-angle shots," he said, still looking at his phone. "I live here, Elias. I would like a cup of tea." "In an hour. Just give us an hour," he said, finally looking at me. There was no affection in his eyes, only a weary irritation, as if I were a difficult employee he couldn't wait to fire. "Why don't you go sit on the back porch? It's a nice day. You can watch the birds." He was dismissing me to the outdoors, like a dog that might shed on the furniture. I didn't argue. I picked up my cardigan and walked out the back door. I sat on the old wicker chair I'd bought with my first paycheck 45 years ago. From there, I could hear the muffled sounds of them moving my life around. I heard the scrape of the dining table being centered. I heard the clink of the silver being shoved into a drawer. I heard the photographer arrive and the professional, false laughter Sarah used when she was trying to impress someone. The exclusion was physical. It was a cold wind on a sunny day. I realized that they had been practicing this for years, this gradual erasure of me. Every time they forgot my birthday but called to ask for a loan, every time they skipped Sunday dinner but sent an emergency text about their car payments, they were preparing for this day. They had already moved me out of their hearts. The house was just the final piece of paperwork. I checked my watch. It was 3:15 p.m. Across the street, at the Miller house, I saw a black sedan pull into the driveway. It was Mr. Aris's associate, a young man named David who was as discreet as he was efficient. He stayed in the car, his eyes on my front door. He was waiting for my signal. I felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, not for the house, but for the siblings I thought I had. I remembered Sarah crying on my shoulder when she failed her bar exam, and how I had paid for her second attempt. I remembered Elias hiding in my room when Father was angry, and how I had taken the blame for the window he'd broken. I had been their shield for so long that they had forgotten the shield was a person. They thought I was made of iron, incapable of feeling the blows I took for them. At 3:45 p.m., the photographer stepped out onto the front porch to take the hero shots of the exterior. Sarah and Elias followed him, standing on the lawn and pointing at the roof, the windows, the flower beds, discussing the potential of the land as if the house itself were already a ruin. "It'll sell in a week," Elias said, his voice carrying in the quiet afternoon air. "This neighborhood is gold. Once we get her into that place in Oak Haven, we can clear the rest of the junk out and be done with it by the holidays." "Oak Haven is expensive, Elias," Sarah cautioned. "We need to make sure her equity covers the buy-in so we don't have to dip into the principal." They weren't even hiding it anymore. They were dividing the spoils while I was still breathing the air. I stood up and walked through the back door, through the kitchen, and straight to the front door. They didn't see me until I was standing on the porch. The photographer looked up, startled. "Could you step back inside, ma'am? I'm trying to get a clean shot of the entrance," he said. "The shot is clean enough," I said. I looked at Sarah. I looked at Elias. They both looked annoyed, their faces tight with the effort of maintaining their concerned sibling personas in front of a stranger. "Martha, please," Sarah sighed. "We're almost finished." "I know," I said. I looked across the street and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the black sedan. David got out of the car. He was carrying 2 thick manila envelopes. He didn't look at me as he crossed the street. He walked straight toward us, his expression professional and blank. "Sarah Vance?" David asked, stopping at the foot of the porch steps. Sarah frowned, her hand going to her throat. "Yes?" "And Elias Vance?" "Who are you?" Elias asked, his voice booming with a false authority. "I'm with the law offices of Aris and Associates," David said. He handed an envelope to Sarah and one to Elias. "You've both been served. Have a good afternoon." He turned and walked back to his car before they could even process the words. The silence that followed was absolute. The photographer, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere, began to pack his gear with frantic speed. Sarah opened her envelope first. I watched her face. The dusty rose lipstick seemed to drain of color as she read the first page. Her breath hitched, a small, jagged sound in the quiet. "What is this?" she whispered. "A notice of termination of lease? For my house?" Elias tore his envelope open, his hands shaking slightly. He skipped the pleasantries and went straight to the bolded text. "Default of contract?" he roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "Breach of maintenance fees? Who the hell is Hemlock Management?" They both looked at me then. I stood on the porch of our parents' home, the house they were trying to take from me, and I felt the weight of 40 years finally begin to lift. "Hemlock is an interesting plant," I said, my voice quiet and steady. "It looks like a common weed, but if you don't respect it, it can be quite lethal." "Martha, what did you do?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "My lease. I have nowhere else to go. Why would you do this?" "I didn't do anything, Sarah," I said. "I'm just managing my assets. Isn't that what we're all doing today?" I walked back inside and closed the door, locking it. For the first time in my life, I didn't care about the mess they were about to make. But as I leaned against the door, listening to their voices rise in a frantic, confused duet on my front lawn, I wondered, had I just saved myself? Or had I finally become as cold as the people who raised me? The pounding on the front door was rhythmic, desperate, and entirely expected. It lacked the polite cadence of a guest and the familiarity of a brother. It was the sound of a business partner realizing they had been outmaneuvered. "Martha, open this door right now!" Elias's voice was muffled by the heavy oak, but the rage was unmistakable. I know you're in there. We aren't finished. I didn't answer. I sat in my father's wingback chair, the one Elias had sat in so comfortably just days ago while discussing my relocation. The room was dim, the only light coming from the street lamp that had just flickered to life. I watched through the sheer curtains as Sarah paced the porch, her phone pressed to her ear, her free hand gesturing wildly. She looked small from this angle, stripped of her curated, socialite confidence. "She's not answering, Elias," I heard her cry out, her voice rising to a pitch that usually preceded a breakdown. "This has to be a mistake, a clerical error. Why would Martha's name be on my lease? She doesn't have that kind of money. She's been living on a pension." "She's been lying to us," Elias spat. I could see him now through the glass of the side window, his face inches from the pane. He looked like a stranger, someone I'd met in a cold boardroom, not the boy I used to make cinnamon toast for on snowy mornings. "She's been hoarding while we struggled. This is some kind of sick power play." I leaned my head back against the chair and closed my eyes. Struggled. Elias's definition of struggling involved missing a country club payment or having to fly commercial. My definition was the 3 years I spent sleeping on a cot in our parents' room so I could hear them breathing, while Elias was expanding his brand in Dubai on money he'd borrowed from the estate and never paid back. The exclusion they had practiced on me for years had finally become mutual. For decades, they had excluded me from their lives, their secrets, and their successes, only including me when there was a chore to be done or a debt to be forgiven. Now, I was excluding them from my sanctuary. It was a cold, quiet victory that tasted like ash. Eventually, the pounding stopped. I heard the low rumble of Elias's SUV and the sharp, angry click of Sarah's heels as they retreated. They were going to their respective homes, homes they now knew were under my control. They were going to spend the night looking at their walls, wondering which ones I owned and which ones I was about to take away. My phone buzzed on the side table. It was Julian. I hesitated before answering. Julian was the youngest, the one who had stayed the quietest during the difficult conversation. He was the architect of their plan, quite literally. He had already drawn up the blueprints for the renovation of this house once I was gone. "Martha?" His voice was soft, hesitant. "I just got a call from Elias. He's losing his mind. He said you served them papers? That you own Sarah's place?" "I do, Julian," I said, my voice steady. "How? When did you even—" "Martha, we're your family. We were trying to help you. We thought you were drowning in this house." "You thought I was an obstacle to your liquidity, Julian. Let's not use the word help when we mean harvest. You wanted to harvest the equity of my life to pay for your mistakes." There was a long pause on the other end. I could hear the background noise of his office, the hum of a plotter, the distant sound of traffic. Julian lived in a glass and steel world of his own making. "I didn't get an envelope," he said finally. "Why didn't I get served?" "Because you don't rent from me, Julian. You own your condo. And you own your firm's building. I have no leverage over your lifestyle." "Then why tell me this? If you aren't attacking me, why are you doing this to them?" "I'm not attacking anyone," I said, looking at the empty cardboard box on my dining table. "I'm simply ending the subsidies. For 40 years, I have been the silent partner in your failures. I have been the one who made sure the taxes were paid, the roofs were mended, and the reputations were kept intact. I'm retiring from that position, Julian, effective immediately." "Martha, Sarah has kids. Where is she supposed to go in 30 days? "She has the equity from the sale of her second husband's house," I said. "The money she told me she lost in the market, but actually put into a private offshore account. I know about the account, Julian. I've known for 2 years. The silence this time was even longer. Julian was the one who had helped her set it up. They were all connected in a web of small, greedy secrets, and they had all assumed I was too old, too tired, and too domestic to notice the strands. "You've been watching us," Julian whispered. It wasn't a question. It was a realization that carried a hint of genuine fear. "I've been loving you," I corrected him. "But when you stop being loved, you start being watched. It's a natural progression." I hung up before he could respond. I stood up and walked to the closet. I pulled out a single, small suitcase, the one I'd used for my honeymoon 40 years ago. I didn't pack the china. I didn't pack the silver. I packed my journals, my camera, and the small ceramic bird Julian had made when he was 9. I walked through the house, turning off the lights one by one. I left the beige pillows Sarah had brought on the sofa. I left the lilies Elias had bought on the counter. The house looked like a model home now, cold, staged, and empty of soul. I walked out the front door and locked it. I didn't look back. I crossed the street in the dark, the pavement cold beneath my shoes. When I reached the Miller house, I let myself in. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I went straight to the bay window and sat on the seat. Across the street, my family home sat in total darkness, a black silhouette against the night sky. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest. I had won. I had protected my future. I had shown them that I was not the victim they wanted me to be. But as I sat in the silence of my new secret house, I realized that I was now truly alone. I had traded my role as the invisible caretaker for the role of the vengeful landlord. I looked at the house Sarah lived in, just a few blocks away. I knew she was in there right now, probably crying, probably calling her lawyer, probably hating me with a fervor she had never felt for anything else in her life. Then, I saw a car pull into the driveway of the family home across the street. It was Julian's car. He didn't get out. He just sat there, his headlights cutting through the dark, illuminating the "for sale" sign that the photographer had hammered into the lawn earlier that afternoon. He sat there for a long time, the engine idling. I wondered if he was looking for me. I wondered if he was looking for the sister who used to hold his hand when the lightning was too loud. My phone chimed. A text from Julian. "I found the blueprints in the trash can in the driveway, Martha. You didn't just leave. You threw us away." I looked at the text, then at the car across the street. I didn't reply. I watched as he finally put the car in reverse and backed out, his tires screeching slightly on the asphalt. I stayed in the window until the sun began to peek over the horizon. I was waiting for something, though I wasn't sure what. Maybe I was waiting for the regret to set in. Maybe I was waiting for the phone to ring with an apology that would never come. But as the first light of Thursday morning hit the "for sale" sign, I realized something that made my blood run cold. In my haste to serve the notices and secure my new life, I had forgotten one very important detail. The trust that held the family home required 3 signatures for a sale. Elias and Sarah would sign in a heartbeat. Julian was the tiebreaker. And Julian was the only one I hadn't served. The first morning in a new house is supposed to smell like hope, or at least like fresh paint and possibility. But as I sat in the kitchen of the Miller house, the only thing I smelled was the bitter dregs of the coffee I'd brewed in a machine I didn't recognize. From my new vantage point, I watched the neighborhood wake up. At 7:15 a.m., the realtor's assistant arrived at the family home. She was young, dressed in a sharp blazer that looked too thin for the morning chill. I watched her adjust the "for sale" sign, adding a "coming soon" rider with a brisk, professional snap. To her, it was just another listing in a high-value zip code. To me, it was the tombstone of my father's legacy. Then came Sarah. She pulled into the driveway of the family home with a screech of tires that spoke of a sleepless night. She didn't look like the polished woman who had poured tea 2 days ago. Her hair was unwashed, pulled back in a frantic knot, and even from across the street, I could see the dark circles beneath her eyes. She carried a stack of folders, likely her lease agreement and the notice David had delivered. She stood on the porch, staring at the front door as if she expected it to apologize to her. She didn't have her key. I'd changed the locks at midnight, a task that had felt more like a burial than a home improvement project. Elias arrived minutes later. He didn't even park. He left his SUV idling in the middle of the street, blocking the neighbor's driveway. He marched up to Sarah, and though I couldn't hear their words, their body language was a symphony of panic. Elias was waving his arms, pointing at the house, then at his phone. Sarah was shaking her head, her shoulders hunched. They were two people who had built their lives on the assumption that I would always be the foundation. Now that the foundation had moved across the street, they were realizing the entire structure was lopsided. I felt a hollow sort of satisfaction, but it was quickly replaced by a cold dread when a third car appeared. Julian. He didn't join them on the porch. He parked his car in front of the Miller house. My house. He sat there for a long moment, looking at the windows. He knew. Of the three of them, Julian was the only one who actually paid attention to details. He had probably spent the night cross-referencing the LLC name on Sarah's notice with public records. Unlike the others, Julian knew how to track a paper trail. He got out of the car and walked slowly up my new driveway. I didn't go to the door. I stayed in the kitchen, my hand trembling slightly as I held my mug. He knocked. Not the pounding of yesterday, but a slow, rhythmic thud. "Martha?" he called through the wood. "I know you're in there. The Miller house has been on the market for months. You bought it, didn't you? You bought the whole block." I walked to the door and opened it. Julian looked tired, but he didn't look angry. He looked impressed, which was somehow worse. "Not the whole block," I said. "Just enough of it." "Why, Martha?" He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the minimalist interior. "You've lived in that drafty old museum for 40 years. You could have moved anywhere. Why stay here and watch us?" "Because I wanted to see the look on your faces when you realized that the woman you were discarding was the one holding the keys to your own front doors," I said. Julian sat at the small breakfast table. Sarah is spiraling. She thinks she's going to be homeless. And Elias? His firm's lease is ironclad, Martha. If you enforce that maintenance default, he's finished. He can't afford a new build-out right now. "He shouldn't have spent his overhead on a summer house in the Hamptons," I replied, sitting across from him. "And Sarah shouldn't have lied about her savings. I didn't create their precarity, Julian. I just stopped hiding it for them." Julian leaned forward, his expression shifting into something more tactical. "You're right. They've been reckless. But you're being emotional. This neighborhood play, it's brilliant, but it's messy. You're hurting the family name." "The family name is currently being hammered into the lawn across the street," I pointed out. "About that," Julian said, his voice dropping. "Elias and Sarah are ready to sign the sale agreement for the house. They need the cash to fight you on the other properties. They think if they get their share of the equity from the family home, they can buy their way out of the holes you've put them in." "And you?" I asked. "You're the third signature, Julian, the tiebreaker." Julian looked out the window at the family home. I could see the gears turning. He was an architect. He didn't see walls, he saw opportunities. "I haven't signed yet," he said, "and I won't. On one condition." I felt a chill. What condition? Give Sarah a 5-year lease extension at her current rate. Forgive Elias's maintenance arrears, and give him a grace period on the office rent. If you do that, I'll block the sale of the family home. You can stay there as long as you want. We'll tell the realtor it was a misunderstanding. He was offering me my life back. The old life. The one where I was the quiet caretaker, tucked away in the drafty museum, while my siblings continued to exploit my silence. He was trying to negotiate a return to the status quo, using the one thing he knew I loved as leverage. "You're asking me to pay for my own prison," I said. "I'm asking you to be the bigger person," Julian countered, "the way you've always been. Don't let this one moment of spite ruin 40 years of being the heart of this family." "The heart is tired of pumping blood into limbs that refuse to move," I said. Julian stood up. "Think about it, Martha. You have until 5 p.m. That's when the listing goes live on the MLS. Once it's public, there's no taking it back without a massive penalty. If I don't hear from you, I'll sign. And then the house is gone. You'll be sitting in this empty Miller house, watching strangers move into our parents' bedroom." He walked to the door, stopping with his hand on the knob. "You think you've won because you own the dirt, Martha. But we own the history. And without us, you're just a woman in a house she doesn't belong in." He left, and the silence he left behind was deafening. I looked across the street. Sarah and Elias were still on the porch, their heads bent together. They looked like they were plotting a war. They didn't see me. They didn't even look toward the Miller house. To them, I was already gone. I realized then that Julian wasn't the good sibling. He was the most dangerous one. He didn't want the money as much as he wanted the stability of my subservience. He wanted the world to make sense again, and in his world, Martha stayed in the kitchen and kept the secrets. My phone rang. It was Mr. Aris. "Martha, I've just received a call from a lawyer representing Elias's firm. They're threatening a countersuit for harassment. And Sarah, she's contacted a local news investigative unit. She's claiming elder abuse in reverse, that you're mentally unstable and using your hoarded wealth to vindictively target your own kin." I looked at the "for sale" sign. The young assistant was taking a selfie in front of it, smiling for her social media followers. "Let them talk," I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. "There's more," Mr. Aris said. "I did some digging into Julian's firm, as you asked. He's not as stable as he looks, Martha. He's the lead architect on a new development project 2 streets over. The Sycamore Heights project?" "I know it," I said. "It's a massive luxury complex." "The project is stalled," Aris said. "The developers lost their primary investor last week. Julian is personally liable for the bridge loans. If that project doesn't move forward by the end of the month, he's not just losing his firm, he's losing everything." I looked out the window at Julian's car as it pulled away. He hadn't come here to save the family. He had come here to save himself. He needed the sale of the family home just as much as the others did, but he was trying to use it to extort a better deal for all of them, so he wouldn't look like the villain. The swing vote wasn't a choice between right and wrong. It was a choice between 3 different ways to betray me. I hung up the phone and walked to the closet. I pulled out a dusty box I hadn't opened in years. Inside was my father's old ledger, the real one, not the one the estate lawyers had seen, but the one he had kept in the floorboard of the study. I spent the next 3 hours reading. By 4 p.m., I knew exactly what I had to do. I didn't call Julian. I didn't call Mr. Aris. I walked across the street, straight toward the for sale sign. Sarah and Elias saw me coming and stood up, their faces hardening into masks of defensive fury. "You have a lot of nerve," Elias began, but I held up a hand. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to make an offer." "An offer?" Sarah sneered. "You've already taken our homes, Martha. What else is there?" "I want to buy your shares of this house," I said. "Right now, cash, for 20% above the market appraisal." They both froze. The greed in the air was thick enough to taste. "But we'd have to cancel the listing," Elias said, his eyes darting to the sign. "The commission—" "I'll cover the commission," I said. "But there's a catch." I looked at the front door of the home I had spent my life in. "You have to tell me the truth about the night Father died," I said, "because I know he didn't die of a heart attack, and I know which one of you was holding the pillow." The silence that followed my words was not the silence of a peaceful afternoon. It was the silence of a vacuum, a sudden absence of air that left Sarah gasping. She looked at Elias, her eyes wide and wet, and for a moment, the dusty rose lipstick made her mouth look like a jagged wound. "Martha," Elias said, his voice cracking. He tried to reclaim his booming authority, but it came out as a thin, desperate rasp. "That is a monstrous thing to say. A hateful, delusional thing to say. Father was 88. He was failing." "He was failing, yes," I said, my voice as cool as the autumn breeze. "But his heart was strong. The doctor said he had another year, maybe more. And then, in the span of 1 hour, while I was at the pharmacy picking up his new prescription, he simply stopped. And the three of you, who hadn't visited in a month, just happened to all be in the room together when it happened." I looked at the for sale sign. The young assistant had moved to the side of the house, out of earshot, but I could still hear the click, click, click of her camera. "I found the ledger, Elias," I continued. "Father kept a log of his vitals. He also kept a log of the things you said to him when you thought I couldn't hear. He wrote about the pressure you were putting on him to sign over the deed. He wrote about the pillows of mercy Sarah kept talking about." Sarah made a small, choked sound and sat down abruptly on the porch steps. "I was joking, Martha. It was a dark joke. We were exhausted. Everyone says things like that when they're caregiving." "I was the one caregiving, Sarah," I reminded her. "You were just visiting the bank. Now, my offer stands. I buy your shares, we dissolve the trust, I take the family home, and I stay in the neighborhood. In exchange, the ledger stays in my safe, and the police never have to wonder why Father's oxygen levels were recorded as perfect at 6 p.m. and 0 at 6:15 p.m. It was a bluff, or at least a partial one. The ledger was real, and Father's notes were heart-wrenching, but they weren't a forensic report. However, in the court of their own guilty consciences, my words were a conviction. "You're blackmailing us," Elias whispered, his face pale. "I'm settling an account," I said. "Think of it as a liquidity event, Elias. Isn't that what you called it?" I turned and walked back across the street, leaving them standing in the shadow of the house they were so eager to sell. I didn't look back until I reached the porch of the Miller house. From there, I watched them. They didn't argue. They didn't shout. They huddled together like children caught in a lie, their shoulders slumped, their movements heavy with the weight of the truth. I went inside and sat in the dark of my new kitchen. I felt a deep physical exhaustion. I had spent 40 years being the good sister, the one who smoothed things over, the one who let them win so the family could stay together. Now, I had finally won. But the family was in pieces on the lawn. The exclusion was now complete. I was no longer a part of their circle, and they were no longer a part of my protection. We were strangers, bound only by a shared crime and a set of property deeds. At 6:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. It was Julian. He looked different than he had a few hours ago. The architect of the future look was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed defeat. He didn't ask to come in. He just stood on the porch, the light from the street lamp casting long, distorted shadows behind him. "They told me what you said," Julian said. His voice was flat, devoid of the tactical edge it usually carried. "And?" I asked. "I wasn't in the room, Martha. I was in the hallway. I didn't see anything." "But you didn't stop it either," I said. "You were the one who told them that the inheritance taxes would be lower if he passed before the new year. I saw that in the ledger too, Julian. Your professional advice to a dying man." Julian looked down at his shoes. "I needed the money for the firm. I thought he was suffering. We all did." "He wasn't suffering," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "He was lonely. There's a difference. But you wouldn't know that because you only measure life in square footage and ROI. Julian stepped back, as if the words were stones. "Sarah and Elias are going to take the deal. They don't have a choice. They're terrified of you, Martha. They think you've turned into some kind of monster." "A monster," I repeated. "Because I'm finally holding them accountable? Because I'm not letting them walk away with the house I maintained while they ignored him?" "Because you're using Father's death as a weapon," Julian said. "Even if they did what you think, using it like this, it makes you one of us." He turned and walked away, his gait uneven. I watched him go, and for a moment, I wanted to call him back. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want to be one of them. I wanted to be the sister who made the cinnamon toast. I wanted the world to go back to being simple, where my only worry was the roof and the taxes. But the world wasn't simple. It was a ledger of debts and betrayals, and for the first time, I was the one holding the pen. I went to the window and looked across the street. The "for sale" sign was still there, but the "coming soon" rider had fallen off and was lying in the grass. The house was dark. My siblings were gone. I picked up my phone and called Mr. Aris. "The deal is moving forward," I said. "Prepare the buyout papers for the family home. And Ben? I want to start the eviction process for Sarah tomorrow. No more extensions, no more grace periods." "Martha," Ben said, a note of hesitation in his voice. "Are you sure? You'll have the house back. You don't need to put her on the street." "I'm not putting her on the street," I said, looking at the dark silhouette of my family home. "I'm just showing her what it feels like to be relocated. Isn't that what she wanted for me?" I hung up and sat in the silence. I thought about the pillows of mercy Sarah had joked about. I thought about the way Father's hand used to shake when he reached for his tea. I realized then that the most devastating part of the betrayal wasn't that they had kicked me out. It was that they had made me realize I was the only person in the family who actually loved the people in it. To them, we were all just assets to be managed. I walked to the bedroom and lay down on the unfamiliar mattress. I closed my eyes, but all I could see was the empty chair in the study across the street. I had my house back. I had my neighborhood. I had my wealth. But as I drifted into a fitful sleep, I found myself wondering, if I was the only one left to tell the story of this family, Was there any point in having a home to tell it in? And then a thought struck me, a cold, sharp realization that made me bolt upright in the dark. If Julian wasn't in the room, and he only heard about my accusation from Sarah and Elias, why did he look so relieved when I said I only had the ledger? The realization that Julian was relieved, not terrified, but relieved, acted like a cold draft in the room. I sat on the edge of the unfamiliar bed in the Miller house, the sheets still smelling of the plastic packaging they'd come in. Julian had always been the most polished of us. Elias was a blunt instrument, and Sarah was a mess of high-strung nerves. But Julian was an architect. He understood how things were built, and more importantly, how they could be dismantled. If he was relieved that I only had the ledger, it meant there was something else out there. Something far more damning than the scribbled grievances of a dying man. At 3 a.m., I did something I hadn't done in months. I opened my laptop and logged into the cloud server for the home security system I'd installed in the family home 3 years ago. I told the siblings about the cameras on the porch and the back door, of course. I'd even told them about the one in the kitchen to make sure Father didn't leave the stove on. But I hadn't mentioned the small, motion-activated lens hidden inside the vintage mantel clock in the study. I'd put it there after Father started having absences, minutes where he would simply stare at the wall, lost in the fog of his own mind. I wanted to see if there was a pattern, a trigger. I hadn't looked at the footage from the night he died. I hadn't been able to. The grief had been a thick, suffocating blanket, and by the time I could breathe again, the funeral was over, the estate was in probate, and my siblings were already measuring the windows for new curtains. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. The archives were set to auto-delete after a year, but I had a premium subscription that backed up motion events to a secondary server. I scrolled back. The dates blurred. November, October, September. Finally, I found it. September 14th. I watched the screen. The study was bathed in the soft amber light of the desk lamp. Father was in his chair, his head tilted back, sleeping. He looked so fragile, a collection of bones held together by translucent skin. At 6:04 p.m., the door opened. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Elias. It was Julian. He walked into the room with a glass of water and a small white pill. He didn't look like a murderer. He looked like a son. He knelt by Father's chair and shook him gently. I watched as Father woke up, squinting against the light. They talked for a moment. I couldn't hear the words, but Julian was smiling. It was that same architect of the future smile he'd given me just hours ago. Julian handed him the pill. Father took it. Julian watched him swallow. Then, Julian didn't leave. He sat on the ottoman at Father's feet and held his hand. He stayed there for 20 minutes, just holding the old man's hand, watching him drift back into a sleep that grew deeper and deeper. At 6:25 p.m., Julian reached up and checked the pulse at Father's neck. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look sad. He looked at his watch, waited exactly 1 minute, and then picked up his phone. He didn't call 911. He called Elias. I closed the laptop. My heart was thudding against my ribs like a trapped bird. Julian hadn't used a pillow. He'd used a prescription. Father had been on a cocktail of heart medications. One extra dose of the wrong thing would have looked like a natural failure to any coroner not looking for a crime. And Julian was the one who had stayed in the hallway while Sarah and Elias discovered the body. He had let them take the psychological weight of the moment while he remained the clean, supportive brother. The imbalance of power in our family had shifted again. I wasn't just the landlord anymore. I was the witness. The next morning, the doorbell rang at 8 a.m. It was Sarah. She looked decimated. She was wearing a tracksuit that looked like she'd slept in it, and she was holding a manila envelope. When I opened the door, she didn't wait for a greeting. She pushed past me into the kitchen. "Here," she said, slamming the envelope onto the counter. "The signed buyout agreement. Elias and I stayed up all night with the notary. It's done. The house is yours. Now please, tell the management company to stop the eviction. My kids, they start school in 2 weeks. I can't move them now." I looked at her. For the first time, I didn't feel that reflexive urge to comfort her. I didn't see my little sister. I saw a woman who had been willing to let her own brother kill their father so she could pay off her secret credit cards. "The eviction stands, Sarah," I said, my voice sounding hollow. "Martha, please!" She grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my sweater. "I'm sorry. We were wrong. We were greedy and stupid, and we didn't think you'd actually fight back. We thought you were just Martha." "And who is Martha to you, Sarah? A bank? A maid? A safety net that never breaks?" "You're our sister," she wailed. "No," I said, stepping back so her hand fell away. "I'm the woman who watched the footage from the study last night." Sarah's face didn't just go pale, it went gray. The air in the kitchen suddenly felt very thin. "Footage?" she whispered. "The clock on the mantel," I said. "It has a lens, Sarah. I saw Julian. I saw the pill. And I saw the phone call." Sarah sank into a kitchen chair, her breath coming in short, ragged hitches. "I didn't know about the pill. I swear to God, Martha, I didn't know. Elias and we just thought it was his time. Julian said he checked on him and he was gone. We went along with it because we needed the money so badly." "You went along with a lie that covered a death," I said. "That makes you an accessory, or at the very least, a coward." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice a mere thread of sound. I looked out the window at the family home. The for sale sign was gone now. The lawn was empty. It was my house again. But it felt like a mausoleum. "I'm going to have a meeting," I said, "with Julian, and you're going to be there. You and Elias, in the study, at 6 p.m. tonight." "He'll kill us," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide with a genuine primal fear. "If he knows you have that, he's not like us, Martha. He's cold. He's always been cold." "He won't kill anyone," I said, though a part of me wondered if I was being naive. "Because I've already sent a copy of the file to Mr. Aris with instructions to release it to the district attorney if anything happens to me, or if the three of you don't show up." I walked Sarah to the door. She moved like a sleepwalker, her body limp and defeated. As she stepped out onto the porch, she turned back to me. "Why didn't you just let us have the house, Martha? We would have been out of your life in a year. Why did you have to dig?" "Because you tried to take the only place I ever felt safe," I said. "And in doing so, you made sure I'll never feel safe anywhere again." I closed the door and locked it. I spent the rest of the day in a state of suspended animation. I didn't eat. I didn't clean. I just sat in the Miller house and watched the clock. I felt a strange sense of detachment, as if I were preparing for a surgery. I realized that the emotional labor I had performed for this family for 40 years was over. I wasn't protecting them anymore. I was dissecting them. At 5:45 p.m., I walked across the street. The air was turning cold, the first real bite of winter. I unlocked the front door of the family home and walked inside. The smell of neutral lilies was still there, cloying and fake. I went into the study. I sat in Father's chair. At 5:55 p.m., Elias arrived. He didn't speak. He sat on the small sofa in the corner, his head in his hands. At 5:58 p.m., Sarah came in, trembling so hard I could hear her teeth chattering. She sat next to Elias. They looked like two people waiting for a verdict. At 6 p.m. sharp, the front door opened. Julian's footsteps were rhythmic and confident. He walked into the study, looking as impeccable as ever in a charcoal overcoat. He looked at me, then at the siblings, then at the clock on the mantel. He didn't look afraid. He smiled. "Well," Julian said, taking off his gloves, "I see we're finally moving past the amateur dramatics and getting down to the real business of the family." He pulled the ottoman over and sat at my feet, exactly where he had sat the night Father died. "So, Martha," he said, his voice smooth and terrifyingly calm, "how much do you want for the clock?" The room was silent, save for the rhythmic, mechanical tick of the mantel clock Julian had just offered to buy. It was a silver sound, sharp and cold, slicing through the heavy atmosphere of the study. Julian sat on the ottoman, his posture relaxed, his hands folded over one knee. He looked like a man discussing a minor zoning variance, not the chemical end of his father's life. "The clock isn't for sale, Julian," I said. My voice was a dry rasp, the sound of dead leaves skittering across a sidewalk. "And neither am I." "Everyone is for sale, Martha. It's just a matter of currency," Julian replied. He glanced back at Sarah and Elias, who were huddled together on the sofa like two passengers on a sinking ship. "Our brother and sister here, for instance. They were sold for the promise of a quick payout and a clean conscience. They wanted the problem of Father to go away, but they didn't want the blood on their hands. I simply provided the service." Sarah let out a small, wounded whimper. "Julian, stop, please." "Why?" "Martha knows. She's seen the footage. There's no point in the performance anymore." Julian turned back to me, his eyes bright with a terrifying intelligence. "You've spent 40 years playing the martyr, Martha. You've carried our secrets, our debts, our laundry. You think that makes you better than us? But all it really did was make you a silent partner. You watched us rot for decades and did nothing but spray perfume on the smell. Now, suddenly, you've found your spine? Why now?" "Because you tried to take the house," I said, "and because I realized that the perfume wasn't working anymore. The rot has reached the foundation." "The foundation is fine," Julian said, his voice sharpening. "Or it would be, if you weren't trying to tear it down."
Let's talk about Sycamore Heights. You know I'm the lead architect. You know the project is stalled. What you might not know is that the holding company that owns the access road to the construction site just changed hands. A company called Hemlock Management. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. "You didn't just buy Sarah's house and Elias's office," Julian continued, a hint of genuine admiration creeping into his tone. "You bought the strip of land that connects my project to the main grid. Without that access, the developers can't move the heavy machinery. The project dies. I go bankrupt. And the family name, the one you claim to protect, becomes synonymous with the biggest financial collapse in the county." Elias looked up, his eyes bloodshot and frantic. "You own the access road, Martha? Is that true?" "I own the land," I said. "I bought it 5 years ago when the county auctioned it off. I thought it might be a good investment. I didn't know then that Julian would try to build a monument to his own ego right next to it." "It's not a monument. It's my life," Julian shouted, his composure finally fracturing. He stood up, pacing the small space of the study. "If you block that road, you aren't just hurting me. You're hurting everyone. Sarah's kids' tuition, Elias's firm, the inheritance. It's all tied to the success of that development. We need the neighborhood to stay high value, Martha. We need the house to sell." "The house is mine," I reminded him. "The buyout is signed. The trust is dissolved." "Then you're sitting on a pile of dirt in the middle of a war zone," Julian yelled. "What do you want, Martha? Do you want us to beg? Do you want us to go to jail? If I go down for what happened to Father, I'm taking every one of you with me. I'll tell them Sarah suggested the dosage. I'll tell them Elias provided the pills from his private stash. I'll make sure the footage looks like a conspiracy, not a solo act."
The exclusion I had felt for so long was suddenly replaced by a terrifying inclusion. He was pulling me back into the muck, dragging me down into the dark cellar of their shared guilt. He was right. In the eyes of the law, a daughter who hidden cameraed her father's death and then used it for leverage was no saint. "I don't want your money, Julian," I said, standing up. I felt a strange, cold clarity. "And I don't want your apologies. I want you to feel what I've felt for 40 years. I want you to feel the weight of being responsible for everything while owning nothing." "What does that mean?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "It means I'm opening the access road," I said. Julian's shoulders slumped in relief, a triumphant smirk starting to form on his lips. But I wasn't finished. "I'm opening it for the construction," I continued. "But I'm also filing a petition with the city to turn the Miller House and the 3 other properties I own on this street into low-income transitional housing, specifically for elderly victims of domestic neglect." The silence that followed was absolute. In this zip code, the one they had fought so hard to keep exclusive and high value, my plan was a death sentence for their property values. The Sycamore Heights project would plummet in value. The lifestyle Elias and Sarah were clinging to would vanish as the neighborhood transformed. "You can't do that," Elias whispered. "The HOA, the zoning." "I've already cleared the preliminary hurdles with the city council," I said. "They're very excited about the Martha Vance Foundation. It's a wonderful legacy for our father. Don't you think?" I looked at the clock. It was 6:25 p.m., the exact time Julian had checked Father's pulse. "You're destroying us," Julian said, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "You're burning the village to kill the spiders." "No," I said, walking toward the door of the study. "I'm just changing the neighbors. You wanted me out of the house because I didn't fit the vibe. Now you'll find that the vibe is changing quite rapidly. You can stay in your homes if you can afford the taxes once your equity disappears, or you can leave, but you won't be leaving with a profit." I stopped at the door and looked back at the 3 of them. They looked like ghosts, flickering in the dim light of the study. "One more thing," I said. "The footage from the clock? It's already been uploaded to a secure server. If anyone tries to interfere with the zoning petition, or if I so much as trip on a sidewalk, it goes to the police. But for now, I think I'd rather watch you all live with what you've done, in a neighborhood that no longer recognizes you." I walked out of the study and through the front door. I crossed the street, the cold air hitting my face like a benediction. When I reached the Miller house, I didn't go inside. I stood on the porch and looked back. The lights in the family home were all on, a bright, golden cage. I felt a sudden, sharp memory of my mother. She used to say that the hardest part of being a mother wasn't the giving, but the realizing when there was nothing left worth giving. I finally understood what she meant. I checked my phone. A notification from my real estate app. A new listing had just appeared 2 blocks away. Sarah's house. She was trying to run. But she didn't know that I had placed a lien on the property for unpaid structural damages discovered during a recent inspection. She wasn't going anywhere until I let her. I sat on my porch swing and began to rock, the wood groaning softly. I was the ghost now, haunting the street I had built. But as I watched the shadows move behind the curtains across the street, a new question began to form. Julian hadn't asked why I bought the access road land 5 years ago. He assumed it was for the developers. He didn't know that I had bought it because Father had asked me to. "Protect the line, Martha," he had whispered months before he died. "Don't let them cross the line." What line was he talking about? The property line? Or something else entirely? I looked at the dark woods behind the Sycamore Heights site. There was something there. Something Father had been terrified of, and something that Julian, in his greed, had just unleashed. The Miller house was a sanctuary of silence, but it was a silence I had bought with a heavy price. I sat in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the glowing numbers of the stove in the kitchen. I kept thinking about the line. In my family, lines were always blurred. My siblings crossed them constantly, lines of decency, lines of honesty, lines of financial sanity. But Father's line had been literal. For as long as I could remember, he had obsessed over the northern boundary of our property, the part that sloped down into a dense, marshy thicket before reaching what was now the Sycamore Heights development. "Don't build there, Martha," he'd told me once, his eyes cloudy with cataracts but sharp with a strange, sudden terror. The ground remembers what we try to bury. I had assumed he was speaking metaphorically, a warning about the family's old skeletons. But as I watched the moonlight hit the distant skeletons of Julian's half-finished luxury condos, I wondered if the warning was more grounded in the soil itself. A heavy, stumbling thud on my front porch interrupted my thoughts. It wasn't the sharp tap of Sarah or the confident stride of Julian. It was the sound of a man who had lost his center of gravity. I opened the door to find Elias. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in an old, stained sweatshirt, and he smelled of cheap bourbon and expensive regret. He didn't look like a high-powered consultant anymore. He looked like a man who had spent 48 hours staring at a bank balance that said 0. "I can't pay the office rent, Martha," he said, his voice thick and slurred. He didn't ask to come in. He just slumped against the doorframe. "The bank froze the business account because of the Hemlock default. I have employees. I have a lease on a car I can't even afford to put gas in." "I told you the subsidies were over, Elias," I said. I didn't feel pity. I felt a weary, clinical detachment. "You were always the favorite," he spat, though there was no heat in it. "Father gave you the house because he knew you'd be the jailer. He knew you'd keep us small. He used to tell me, 'Elias, you're ornamental. You're for show. Martha is the one who keeps the lights on.' Do you know what that does to a son? To be told you're just furniture? You chose to be furniture, Elias. You chose the gold leaf and the velvet while I was in the basement fixing the pipes," I said. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw the wound beneath the greed. He had spent his life trying to prove he was more than ornamental, and in doing so, he had become a caricature of the man he wanted to be. He had built a life of glass, and I had just thrown the first stone. "Julian is going to kill you," Elias whispered. He wasn't threatening me. He was warning me. Not with a pill or a pillow. He's going to use the project. He's already talking to the developers about eminent domain. They're going to try to claim your access road is essential for public safety. They're going to sue you until you're as broke as I am. "Let them try," I said. Public safety is a hard argument to make when you're building luxury condos for the 1%. And besides, Julian has a bigger problem than me. "What problem?" "The ground," I said. "He's crossing the line, Elias. Father's line." Elias frowned, his brow furrowing in a drunken effort to remember. "The marsh? That's just mud, Martha. Julian had surveyors. They said it was fine once they put the pilings in."
"Surveyors see what they're paid to see," I said. I walked him to his car and watched him fumbling with his keys. I shouldn't have let him drive, but I couldn't bring myself to care enough to stop him. He was a ghost in his own life, haunting the remains of a dream that had finally collapsed. After he crawled away into the night, I put on my boots and a heavy coat. I took a high-powered flashlight from the kitchen drawer and walked out toward the back of the property. The air was damp and heavy with the scent of rotting leaves and stagnant water. I walked past the family home, its windows dark and judgmental, and headed toward the slope. The line was marked by a row of ancient, twisted ironwood trees. Beyond them lay the buffer zone I had bought 5 years ago, the land that separated our history from Julian's future. I reached the edge of the construction site. It was a scar on the earth, a massive pit where the foundation for the main tower was supposed to be poured. The heavy machinery sat silent and predatory in the moonlight. I climbed over the low silt fence and walked toward the center of the pit. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, reflecting off the pools of oily water that had gathered at the bottom. I stopped. The ground beneath my feet felt wrong. It wasn't just mud, it was spongy, with a rhythmic, almost organic vibration. I knelt down and pressed my hand to the earth. I felt it then. A deep, low hum, like a heartbeat muffled by a mile of dirt. I moved the flashlight beam to the base of the nearest piling, one of the massive steel beams Julian had driven into the earth to support the weight of his monument. The steel was buckling. Not much, just a fraction of an inch, but enough to cause a spider web of cracks in the surrounding concrete. And from the cracks, something was seeping. It wasn't water. It was a thick, black slurry that smelled of sulfur and old, forgotten things. I remembered the line then. I remembered the old maps I'd found in Father's desk. The ones from the 1920s that showed a natural sinkhole that the local coal company had used as a dumping ground for toxic runoff before the EPA existed. Father hadn't been protecting a family secret. He had been protecting the neighborhood from a literal poison. He knew that if anyone ever broke the seal of that marsh, the entire hillside would become unstable. Julian hadn't just built on a lie. He had built on a ticking time bomb. And by driving those pilings so deep, he had pierced the line Father had spent his life guarding. I stood up, my heart racing. I looked back at the Miller house, then at the family home. If I told Julian, he would cover it up. He would pour more concrete, hide the cracks, and sell the condos before the ground gave way. People would move in, families would sleep there, and one day, the earth would simply open up and swallow them. If I didn't tell him, he would go bankrupt when the inspectors finally noticed. But he might take the whole neighborhood down with him. I looked at the black slurry on my fingers. It felt cold, like the touch of a grave. I realized then that the imbalance of our family had reached its final, ugly peak. I was the only one who knew the truth,
which meant I was the only one responsible for what happened next. I had spent 40 years being necessary to my siblings' lives, but now I was necessary to their survival. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if they were worth saving. I turned to walk back to the house, but the flashlight beam caught something in the trees. A figure was standing by the ironwoods, tall, still, and watching. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" the voice said. It was Julian. He wasn't wearing a suit this time. He was wearing a construction vest, and he was holding a clipboard. "The way the light hits the steel, it looks like progress." "It looks like a collapse, Julian," I said, my voice steady despite the thudding in my chest. He walked toward me, his boots squelching in the mud. He didn't look at the cracks. He looked at me. "I know what's under here, Martha," he said softly. "I've always known. Why do you think I needed the money from the house so badly? I have to finish the pour before the next rain. Once the foundation is capped, it doesn't matter what's underneath. It'll be someone else's problem in 20 years. "You're going to kill people," I said. "I'm going to build a legacy," he corrected. "And you're going to help me. Because if this project fails, the Martha Vance Foundation for the Elderly will be sitting on a toxic wasteland. You'll be the owner of the most expensive disaster in the state." He stepped closer, the smell of sulfur and charcoal surrounding him. "The line was never meant to protect the world from us, Martha," he whispered. "It was meant to protect us from the world. Now give me the access road, or we all go into the pit together." I looked at my brother, the boy I had once protected from the dark, and I realized that the dark had finally won. I stood in the center of the construction pit, the black, sulfurous sludge seeping into the soles of my boots. Julian's shadow was long and jagged against the concrete pilings, stretched by the moonlight into something that didn't look human. He was waiting for me to do what I had always done: find the solution, bridge the gap, and keep the peace. "You're asking me to sign off on a mass grave, Julian," I said. My voice was barely a whisper, yet it felt like it carried the weight of the entire hillside. "I'm asking you to be pragmatic," he replied, his voice smooth and terrifyingly reasonable. "If we stop now, the city will condemn the site. The runoff will be declared a hazard. Every property within a mile, including yours, Martha, will be worthless. The lawsuits will last decades." "Is that the legacy you want for Father? To be the man who sat on a poison well and left it for his children to drown in?" "He didn't leave it for us to drown in," I said, looking at the cracks in the foundation. "He stayed here to make sure no one ever opened it. You're the one who brought the shovel." Julian stepped closer, his hand reaching out as if to pat my shoulder in that old, condescending way. I stepped back, and his hand hung in the air for a second before he dropped it. "Go home, Martha. Get some sleep. Tomorrow morning, the management company will send over the permit for the access road. I'll handle the inspectors. We'll cap the site by Friday, and this will all just be subtext, something the buyers never need to know." I didn't answer. I turned and walked out of the pit, my boots heavy with mud. I could feel his eyes on my back, measuring me, calculating my breaking point. When I got back to the Miller house, the first thing I did was take off my boots and leave them on the porch. I went to the kitchen and scrubbed my hands with lemon-scented soap, but the smell of sulfur lingered in my pores. It felt like the family's rot was finally becoming physical, something I could no longer wash away with common sense or emotional labor. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the 3 envelopes on the counter, one for Elias, one for Sarah, and the one I had prepared for Julian. At 10 p.m., a car pulled into the driveway. It was Sarah's sedan. She didn't come to the door. She just sat in the car, her headlights illuminating the kitchen window. A few minutes later, Elias's SUV pulled in behind her. They were like wounded animals seeking the only shelter they knew, even though they knew I was the one who had set the woods on fire. I opened the door and stood on the porch. They both got out of their cars, looking small and fragile in the cold night air. "He told us," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Julian called. He told us about the marsh. Martha, if the project fails, I'm ruined. I've already spent the advance I took on the equity from the family home. I've paid off my debts. If I have to give that money back, I'll lose everything. I can't even afford the lawyer to fight the Hemlock default, Martha," Elias added, his voice stripped of its bourbon-soaked bravado. "I'm looking at bankruptcy by the end of the month. Julian says you're the only one who can stop it. Please, just sign the access permit." The dependency was a physical weight. They were leaning on me with all their collective failures, expecting my strength to hold them up one last time. They didn't see me as a person. They saw me as the safety net. "Come inside," I said. They followed me into the Miller house. It was a cold, sterile space compared to the family home across the street. I didn't offer them tea. I didn't offer them comfort. I sat at the table and placed a small glass jar in the center. Inside was a sample of the black sludge I had taken from the pit. "That's what's under Julian's building," I said. "It's coal runoff and heavy metals. It's been stewing there for 80 years. If he caps it, the pressure will eventually push that sludge into the groundwater. In 5 years, the people living in those condos will be getting sick. In 10 years, the whole hillside will be a cancer cluster." Elias looked at the jar, then away. "But it hasn't happened yet. Maybe it won't. Maybe Julian is right. Maybe the concrete will hold." "You're willing to bet lives on a maybe just to save your car payments?" I asked. "It's not just car payments, Martha. It's my life," Sarah cried out, slamming her hand on the table. "Why do you have to be so righteous? You've always been like this, sitting in judgment while we tried to actually live." "I wasn't sitting in judgment, Sarah. I was sitting in the room with Father while he died," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous level of calm. "And while he was dying, he was trying to tell me about the line. He knew this would happen. He knew your greed would eventually lead you to the pit." A heavy silence fell over the room. Sarah looked at her hands. Elias stared at the floor. The psychological imbalance was shifting again. They needed me to be the good sister so they could feel like good people. If I refused to help them, I wasn't just a landlord, I was the villain of their story. "What do you want, Martha?" Elias asked, his voice barely audible. "Do you want us to go to jail? Do you want us to be homeless? What is the price for your forgiveness?" "I don't have forgiveness for sale, Elias," I said, "but I do have an offer." I leaned forward, looking from one to the other. "I will sign the access permit for Julian. I will let the construction continue. I will even drop the eviction notice for Sarah and the default for Elias." Sarah gasped, a look of pure, desperate relief flooding her face. Elias closed his eyes, his shoulders dropping 2 inches. "But," I continued, "only if you both sign a confession. A full, notarized statement detailing Julian's involvement in Father's death. Every pill, every phone call, every dark joke. You sign it and I put it in a safe deposit box. As long as the 3 of you stay away from this neighborhood and never contact me again, the box stays closed." "You're asking us to betray Julian," Sarah whispered. "No," I said. "I'm asking you to stop being his accomplices. I'm giving you a chance to be free of him. But you have to choose, the money or your brother." I saw the gears turning. I saw the greed wrestling with the remnants of family loyalty. It was a slow, painful spectacle. Sarah looked at Elias. Elias looked at the jar of black sludge. "He'll kill us if he finds out," Elias said. "He'll only find out if you tell him," I replied. "And why would you? Once you sign, you're safe from me, and you're safe from the poverty you're so terrified of." The tension in the room was a living thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. I was using the very thing I despised, their greed, to dismantle the one thing they had left, their unity. "I'll do it," Sarah whispered. "Sarah," Elias gasped. "I have children, Elias," she snapped, her eyes flashing with a sudden, ugly pragmatism. "Julian made his own bed. He's the one who gave the pill. Why should I lose my house for his crime?" Elias looked at me, and I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not respect, but a profound, chilling fear. He realized that the sister who had always been the heart of the family had finally developed a mind for the kill. "Give me the pen," Elias said. I didn't feel a sense of victory as they signed. I felt a deep, hollow exhaustion. I watched them sign their names our parents had chosen with hope, on a document that would forever bind them to a betrayal. As they finished, I took the papers and put them in a folder. "The permits will be ready in the morning," I said. "Now leave. Both of you." They left without a word. I watched their taillights disappear from the driveway. I was alone in the Miller house, the jar of black sludge still sitting on the table. But as I sat there, I realized something. Julian hadn't just built on a toxic marsh. He had built his entire career on a lie about his credentials. I'd seen a small, insignificant detail in the folder Mr. Aris had sent me, a discrepancy in his licensing dates from 20 years ago. Julian wasn't just a murderer and a greedy developer. He was a fraud. And if he was a fraud, the foundation he was pouring wouldn't just leak. It would collapse long before the first condo was sold. I looked at the access permit on the counter. If I signed it, I was letting the construction proceed. I was letting the disaster happen. I picked up the pen, my hands steady. But then my phone buzzed. A text from a number I didn't recognize. "The sludge isn't the only thing Father buried in the North Woods, Martha. Check the ironwood tree with the hollow trunk before Julian finds it." I looked out the window toward the woods. The darkness seemed to press against the glass, thick and expectant. I didn't take a shovel. I took a heavy kitchen knife and my flashlight. The walk back to the North Woods felt different this time. The air was no longer just cold. It felt thin, as if the very atmosphere was retreating from the ground beneath my feet. I crossed the line of ironwood trees, their bark silver and skeletal in the moonlight. I found the one with the hollow trunk, a gnarled, ancient thing that looked like a hand reaching out of the earth in a silent scream. I reached into the hollow. My fingers brushed against spider webs and dry rot before hitting something cold and metallic. I gripped it and pulled. It was a small, rusted fishing tackle box, the kind Father used to carry when we were children. I sat on the damp ground, the flashlight propped against a root, and pried the box open. Inside were several layers of oilcloth. I unwrapped them slowly, my breath hitching in the quiet. There were no jewels, no gold. There were only papers, stacks of yellowed correspondence, and a small, leather-bound notebook that predated the one I had found in the study. I began to read. It wasn't a record of vitals. It was a record of payments. October 1962. Received $500. Marsh levels stable. No seepage reported. August 1974. Received $1,200. Covered the north vent with gravel and topsoil. The line holds. The letters were from the Blackwood Coal and Coke Company. They were addressed to my father. They weren't threats.
They were business arrangements. My father hadn't been a gatekeeper out of some noble sense of duty to the environment or the neighborhood. He had been a paid silence. This house, the family home I had sacrificed 40 years to maintain, had been bought with the money he earned keeping the pit a secret, while the company finished its operations and vanished into a new corporate name. The line he told me to protect wasn't about safety. It was about the statute of limitations. He was terrified that if anyone dug too deep before he died, the bribes would be discovered, the land would be seized, and his legacy would be revealed as a fraud. I sat in the dark, the papers trembling in my hand. For 40 years, I had viewed my father as a man of quiet integrity, a victim of my siblings' greed. I had stayed behind to care for him because I believed he was the only thing holding the family's moral center together. But there was no center. There was only a layer of topsoil over a poison well. I felt a sudden, violent surge of nausea. The emotional labor I had performed, the decades of cleaning his wounds, listening to his fears, and defending his memory against Elias and Sarah's resentment, it had all been service to a lie. I wasn't the heart of the family. I was the janitor of a crime scene. I heard a twig snap behind me. I didn't turn. I didn't reach for the knife. I just sat there as the light from another flashlight cut through the trees. "You found it," the voice said. It wasn't Julian. It was the low, gravelly tone of an older man. I stood up slowly, turning to see Mr. Miller. Not the man I had bought the house from. His father, the original owner of the property I now lived in. He was 84, leaning heavily on a cane, his eyes reflecting the harsh light of the flashlights. "I sent the text," he said. "I've been watching you, Martha. Watching you fight for that house. I thought you deserved to know what you're really fighting for." "You knew?" I asked, my voice sounding like it belonged to a stranger. "Everyone on this street over 70 knows," Miller said, his voice a dry rattle. "Your father was the one who took the money. My father was the one who took the buyout and moved to the other side of town. This whole neighborhood is built on a bribe, Martha. Why do you think the developers were so eager to come in? They didn't have to worry about old environmental surveys. Your father made sure the records vanished in the 80s. "Julian knows," I whispered. It wasn't a question. "Julian is his father's son," Miller said. "He's not just building condos. He's trying to finish the job. If he caps that pit, the evidence is buried under 500 tons of concrete forever. He's not just looking for a profit. He's looking for a clean slate." I looked down at the tackle box. My father hadn't been a victim. Julian wasn't just a villain. They were partners across time. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "Because I'm tired of looking at those ironwoods, Martha. And because I think you're the only person in this family who actually has a soul. I wanted to see what you'd do when you realized the soul was the only thing you had that wasn't for sale." He turned and walked back toward the Miller house, his cane thudding softly on the earth. I didn't follow him. I stayed in the woods until the sun began to gray the horizon. I didn't feel angry anymore. I felt nothing. It was a cold, hollow vacuum where my life used to be. The withdrawal was complete. I no longer cared about the house. I no longer cared about the neighborhood. I didn't even care about the confessions Sarah and Elias had signed. I walked back to the Miller house, my clothes damp and smelling of rot. I didn't shower. I didn't change. I sat at the kitchen table and waited. At 7 a.m., Julian's car pulled into the driveway.
He came to the door, looking fresh, focused, and ready for victory. He saw the permit on the table. He saw the folder next to it. He didn't see the tackle box. I had hidden it in the pantry.
"Martha," he said, his voice bright with a morning energy that felt like a slap in the face. "It's a big day. I assume everything is in order?" I looked at him. I saw the shape of his jaw, so like our father's. I saw the way he adjusted his cuffs, the same nervous habit Father had when he was lying. "The permit is signed, Julian," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the exhaustion or the righteousness of the previous night. He reached for it, but I didn't let go. "But I'm not giving it to you because I want to save the family," I said. "I'm giving it to you because I don't want anything to do with it. The house, the land, the legacy, it's all yours." Julian's brow furrowed. He wasn't used to me being indifferent. He thrived on the conflict, on the negotiation. "What are you talking about? You just bought the shares, you're the owner." "I'm the owner of a record," I said. "I'm giving you the access road. I'm dropping the petitions. I'm letting you pour the concrete. But I want one thing in exchange." "What?" "I want you to sign a document that says I am no longer part of the trust, the estate, or the family. A legal severance. I don't want a dime from the sale. I don't want the house. I want to be a stranger to you." Julian laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Martha, don't be dramatic. You're upset. You've had a long week." "I've had a long 40 years, Julian," I said. "Sign the paper." I slid a single sheet of paper toward him, a document Mr. Aris had prepared weeks ago as a just-in-case measure, though he hadn't known then why I'd really need it. Julian looked at the paper, then at the permit. He saw the path to his future, clear, unobstructed, and paved with my silence. "If that's what you want," he said, shrug. He signed it with a flourish. "But you're making a mistake. In 2 years, this place will be the crown jewel of the county. You'll be sitting in this little rental watching the value of that house triple, and you won't have a piece of it." "I hope so," I said. "I really do." He took the permit and left, his tires crunching confidently on the gravel. I stood at the window and watched him drive across the street. I watched him meet the foreman at the pit. I watched the first cement truck pull into the access road I had just opened. I felt a strange, quiet lightness. I went to the pantry and retrieved the tackle box. I didn't burn the papers. I didn't call the police. I walked to the kitchen and picked up my phone. I dialed a number I had found in the yellowed correspondence. A number for a man named Dr. Aris, Ben's father, the retired environmental lawyer who had first suspected the pit 40 years ago. "Dr. Aris?" I asked when he picked up. "My name is Martha Vance. I think it's time we talk about the North Woods, not for the sake of the neighborhood, but for the sake of the truth." As I spoke, I watched the cement truck begin to tilt its drum. Julian stood at the edge of the pit, his arms crossed, looking like a king. He didn't know that the concrete wasn't the end of the story. He didn't know that the weight of all that stone was exactly what the unstable ground beneath needed to finally, irrevocably, give way. And he didn't know that I wasn't just withdrawing from the family. I was withdrawing the only thing that had ever truly held the hillside up, my willingness to lie for them. The silence in the Miller house was no longer the silence of a woman waiting for the next blow. It was the silence of a house where the clocks had been stopped by choice. For the first time in 40 years, I didn't have a schedule that revolved around someone else's needs. I didn't have to check the thermostat in the family home to ensure the pipes didn't freeze, and I didn't have to keep a mental inventory of the medications in Father's cabinet. I sat on the window seat, watching the steady parade of cement trucks. The sound was a low, industrial thrum that vibrated through the glass, a constant reminder of Julian's progress. He was down there in the pit, directing the flow, burying the secret Father had guarded for half a century. To Julian, the concrete was a shield. To me, it was a weight.
I felt a strange, phantom sensation in my hands, the muscle memory of reaching for the phone to call Sarah, to remind her that her children's school forms were due, or to call Elias to make sure he'd remembered his cardiologist appointment. I let the sensation fade. I sat on my hands until they went numb. The withdrawal was physical, a detoxification from a lifetime of emotional labor. The doorbell rang at noon. I knew the rhythm. It was Sarah. I didn't answer. I watched through the sheer curtains as she stood on the porch, her face pressed against the glass of the door. She looked bedraggled. The dusty rose lipstick was gone, her lips pale and chapped. She was holding a stack of mail, bills no doubt. "Martha!" she shouted, her voice muffled by the door. "Martha, I know you're in there. The water has been turned off at my house. The management company says there's a service hold because of the lien. I have the kids, Martha. I can't give them a bath." I looked at her. I felt a flicker of the old Martha, the one who would have reached for her checkbook, who would have made the call, who would have apologized for a crisis she didn't create. But that Martha was buried under the ironwoods. I stayed still. I watched her bang on the door until her fists were red. She eventually slumped against the railing, crying with a desperation that was entirely self-centered. She wasn't crying because she had lost her sister. She was crying because she had lost her servant. "You're a monster!" she screamed at the door, before finally retreating to her car. I didn't feel like a monster. I felt like a mirror. I was finally showing her the life she had built for herself, without my hands there to catch the falling pieces. An hour later, Dr. Aris arrived. He was a small man with white hair that stood up in tufts like a startled bird, but his eyes were sharp and clear behind thick spectacles. He didn't look at the Miller house as he entered. He looked across the street at the construction site. "He's pouring the slab," Dr. Aris said, his voice a dry rasp. He sat at my kitchen table and spread out the maps I had found in the tackle box. The fool. He thinks he's capping it. He doesn't understand the chemistry of that marsh. "Explain it to me," I said, sitting across from him. "The coal runoff wasn't just heavy metals, Martha. It was sulfuric acid byproducts. For 80 years, that mixture has been reacting with the limestone shelf beneath this hill. It's been creating a series of subterranean voids, caves essentially, filled with pressurized gas and toxic slurry. Your father knew. That's why he never allowed anything heavier than a garden shed to be built on the north side." He tapped a finger on the site of Julian's tower. By driving those steel pilings, Julian pierced the limestone cap. And now, by pouring thousands of tons of wet concrete on top of it, he's increasing the surface weight beyond the shelf's capacity to hold. It's like putting a lead weight on a cracked eggshell. The concrete won't seal it. It will shatter it. "When?" I asked. "Could be days, could be weeks. But the rain is coming tonight," Dr. Aris said, looking at the darkening sky. "If the runoff from the storm fills those voids while the concrete is still curing, the hydrostatic pressure will be astronomical. The ground won't just sink, Martha. It will liquefy." I looked out the window. The first gray clouds of the storm were rolling in from the east, heavy with the promise of a long, cold soak. I saw Julian standing on the edge of the pit, his hands on his hips, watching the last truck pull away. He looked triumphant. "You have to tell the city," I said. "I've already filed the emergency injunction," Dr. Aris replied. "But the city council moves like cold molasses, and Julian has friends in the building department. They'll wait for a formal hearing, and by then the foundation will be set. Or at least, Julian thinks it will be." He looked at me over his glasses. "You've legally severed yourself from the family," Ben told me. "You have no liability. You could leave right now, drive to the coast, be gone before the first crack appears." "I can't," I said. "Why? For them?" He gestured toward the siblings' houses. "No," I said. "For the house. I spent 40 years keeping it standing. I want to see if it can survive the truth." After Dr. Aris left, I went to the basement of the Miller house. I didn't look for things to pack. I looked at the foundation. It was solid, built on the high side of the street, far from the limestone shelf. I was safe here. But the family home, the house that held every memory I had, both the beautiful and the poisoned, was directly in the path of the potential slide. As the sun went down, the rain began. It started as a gentle patter, then turned into a steady, rhythmic drumming. I sat in the dark, the lights of the Miller house extinguished. I didn't want to be seen. I wanted to be a witness. At 9 p.m., I heard a sound. It wasn't the thunder. It was a low, subterranean groan, a sound so deep it was felt in the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of the earth protesting. I went to the window. Across the street, the construction site was a sea of mud. The new concrete slab looked like a gray island in the middle of a dark lake. The security lights flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. I saw a figure moving near the pit. It was Julian. He was in a yellow slicker, holding a flashlight, pacing the perimeter of the slab. He must have heard it too. He was checking the pilings, checking the drainage, trying to convince himself that he had won. Then, I saw a second car pull into the driveway of the family home. Elias. He got out of the car, his movements frantic. He ran toward Julian, waving his arms. They stood at the edge of the pit, their voices lost to the wind and the rain, but their body language was unmistakable. Elias was panicked. Julian was dismissive. Suddenly, the ground didn't just groan, it shifted. A crack, jagged and bright as lightning, appeared across the center of the concrete slab. It happened in slow motion. The gray island split in two. I watched as the flashlight in Julian's hand fell, its beams spinning through the air before disappearing into the widening dark of the fissure. Julian and Elias scrambled back, their boots slipping in the mud. They didn't run toward each other. They ran in opposite directions, Elias toward his car, Julian toward the ironwoods. I stood in the window, my breath fogging the glass. I realized then that I wasn't scared. I felt a profound, chilling sense of completion. The instability I had felt in my family for 40 years had finally reached the surface. The emotional labor I had performed to keep them together was nothing compared to the work the earth was doing now to tear them apart. I reached for the phone. I didn't call 911. I didn't call Sarah. I called the number for the management company that handled my properties. "This is Martha Vance," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Release the lien on Sarah's house and cancel the default for Elias's office. Do it now." "Ma'am?" the clerk asked, confused. "In the middle of the night?" "Yes," I said. "I want them to have their homes back. I want them to have everything they ever wanted." I hung up. I wanted them to be inside their houses when they realized that the neighborhood they had fought so hard to steal was literally falling into the pit they had dug. I looked back at the family home. The lights in the study were still on, and as I watched, the front porch, the one I had swept every morning for 40 years, began to tilt, just a fraction of an inch, toward the north. The rain turned the construction site into a churning graveyard of wet cement and broken dreams. By midnight, the jagged crack in the foundation had widened into a chasm. The sound of the family home groaning, the literal screech of wood pulling away from stone, was a noise I will hear in my sleep for the rest of my days. Elias and Julian were standing in the mud, illuminated by the flickering security lights. They weren't fighting anymore. They were simply staring at the house as the front porch finally gave way, sliding 3 feet down the hill with a sound like a gunshot. Sarah's car screeched into the street. She tumbled out, her face ghost white. She saw the tilt of the house, the mud rising around the foundation, and the "for sale" sign lying face down in a puddle. "Martha!" she screamed, spotting me on the porch of the Miller house. She ran across the street, her brothers trailing behind her like defeated soldiers. "Martha, help us! The house is going! Julian says the whole hillside is sliding! What do we do?" I stood at the top of my steps, dry and still. I looked at the 3 of them, the architect, the consultant, and the socialite. They were covered in the very filth they had spent their lives pretending didn't exist. "You have your houses back," I said, my voice carrying over the wind. "I released the liens. I canceled the defaults. You own your properties again, free and clear." "What good is a house on a sinking hill?" Elias roared, his voice cracking. "The value is gone. The neighborhood is a catastrophe. We're ruined." "You're not ruined," I said softly. "You're just relocated. Isn't that the word you used for me?" "You knew," Julian whispered, stepping forward. He looked at me with a mixture of horror and awe. "You knew the ground would fail. You let us pour the concrete. You let us destroy ourselves." "I didn't let you do anything, Julian," I said. "I simply stopped stopping you. For 40 years, I was the one who braced the walls and shored up the foundations, both of this house and of your lives. I decided to see what would happen if I just let go." "We can't live here," Sarah sobbed. "The water is toxic. The ground is moving. We have to sell." "To whom?" I asked. "No bank will mortgage a house in a containment zone, and no buyer will touch a street that's currently being featured on the midnight news as an environmental disaster." "You bought the houses, Martha." Sarah grabbed the railing of my porch. "You have the money. Buy us out. Save us." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no anger, just a profound, peaceful emptiness. "I'm not a bank, Sarah," I said, "and I'm not your safety net anymore." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan and pulled out a small, leather-bound folder. I handed it to Julian. He opened it, his hands trembling. It wasn't a deed or a check. It was a copy of the legal charter for the Vance Environmental Trust. "I didn't just buy the neighborhood to be your landlord," I said. "I bought the houses to ensure that the land could never be developed again. As of 1 hour ago, I donated the Miller House and the other 4 properties I own to the State Environmental Agency as a permanent research station. The entire block has been designated a non-habitable remediation zone." The siblings stared at me, the rain washing the mud down their faces. "What about us?" Elias whispered. "The state will offer you a fair market value buyout," I said, "based on the current value of the land, which, given the toxic seepage and the structural collapse, is approximately 12 cents on the dollar. It should be just enough to cover your bankruptcy filings." "You planned this," Julian said, his voice trembling. "From the moment you bought that first house across the street. You've been waiting for us to fail." "I was waiting for you to be honest," I corrected him. "But you couldn't do that. Even with Father's life on the line, you chose the concrete." I turned and walked back into the Miller house. I didn't lock the door. There was no point. I went to the hallway and picked up my single suitcase. "Wait!" Sarah cried from the porch. "Where are you going? You can't leave us here." I stopped at the door and looked back one last time. I'm going to the Oak Haven Assisted Living Community, I said. Sarah's face brightened with a flicker of hope. The one we suggested? You're going there? I am, I said, but not as a resident. I bought the parent corporation 3 years ago with the consulting fees Julian's firm paid to my faceless LLC. I'm moving into the owner's suite. I hear the activities are lovely, and the staff is quite attentive. I stepped out onto the porch, opening my umbrella. I walked down the steps, past my siblings who stood frozen in the rain. I didn't look at the family home, as it gave another sickening groan. The surprising part wasn't that I had won. The surprising part was the letter I'd found at the very bottom of Father's tackle box. A letter I hadn't told them about. It was a copy of a second will, dated 10 years ago. In it, Father hadn't left me the house. He had left the house to the 3 of them. And he had left the entire cash fortune from the coal company, millions of dollars, to me. He knew they would try to kick me out. He knew they would see the house as the prize and me as the obstacle. He had set the trap, then I had simply watched them walk into it. He had given them exactly what they wanted, knowing it would be the very thing that destroyed them. "Martha!" Elias called out as I reached the end of the driveway, where a black car was waiting for me.
Why did you do it? Why stay for 40 years if you had the money all along? I paused with my hand on the car door. I looked at the dark, crumbling silhouette of our history. Because, I said, my voice catching for only a second, I wanted to give you every chance to prove me wrong. I wanted to see if even one of you would choose me over the dirt. I got into the car. As we drove away, I looked out the rear window. The "For Sale" sign was finally swallowed by the mud, disappearing into the dark. My siblings were left standing on a street that no longer belonged to them, in a neighborhood that was officially a ghost town. I leaned back against the cool leather seat and closed my eyes. For the first time in 40 years, the house was quiet.